I thought we were just keeping the feds out of marijuana. I thought that was the idea here. Welcome to A Higher Law, a cannabis podcast from the Dykema law firm. I'm your host, John Frazier. I'm the Michigan team leader of Dykema's cannabis practice. For more episodes, you can find us at youtube.com/Dykema Law. Joining me today is Jerry Hincka, consultant and project manager from EHS Support. Today we'll be talking about you don't know what you don't know. Cannabis EHS compliance, effectively kind of looking at where are blind spots that folks have when it comes to environmental health and safety regulations, which I think is just going to be a fascinating conversation. So, Jerry, thanks so much for joining us here today. We're thrilled to have you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. EHS Support is a global environmental consulting firm. We work with multinational clients throughout all industries, Fortune 500 companies down to simple mom and pop operations, small business operations, and helping people understand their requirements and best practices when it comes to environmental health and safety regulations.
And maybe we should start right there with the obvious question. What are we talking about when we say the term environmental health and safety regulations? What should people be thinking of?
Well, it's a pretty broad subject matter. It includes, for a small business, for a cannabis-related business, the materials you use in your process, materials that you might store, the product that your business is producing, throughout the steps of that growing process, processing activity, and then shipping, storage. There are certain regulations that apply to how you manage those things. And an additional area is health and safety and what is necessary to record, to practice, to set in place to protect the people who are working within your organization. So there's a lot of elements to it, but those are pretty broad buckets that it fits into.
Okay. So you use the term regulators and we use the term regulations. I think most operators in the cannabis industry are going to be familiar with the concept of regulation, but I think you're probably talking about pretty different regulators than the cannabis regulatory authorities that most cannabis operators are familiar with. Can you run us through who's administering, what agencies are administering these EHS regulations?
Certainly. There is the EPA on a federal level. At state levels, there will be state agencies like Eagle in the United States, in Michigan, or Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Those are two states that were really active in the cannabis industry. From a safety standpoint, there's OSHA, and there are federal regulations associated with that. And then there are state adopted or state specific regulations that generally will align with the federal program, but there are some state specifics that may vary depending on the state that you're in. There is Michigan OSHA or MyOSHA that someone operating here in Lansing would need to attend to.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I think it would come as news for a lot of cannabis operators because some of the regulatory bodies you just mentioned there are pretty big federal regulators. Are you saying these cannabis businesses operating federally illegal businesses need to be mindful of federal regulation? I thought we were just keeping the feds out of marijuana. I thought that was the idea here.
That's one of the ironies of the cannabis industry is, yes, it is federally illegal, but within specific states, growers, processors, retailers are allowed to operate, and I don't want to play lawyer, but within the applicable laws within that state. So if you are operating a business, any business in the United States, you are subject to OSHA regulations or environmental regulations. You're certainly not exempt, and there are not variances allowed because you are operating a business that's not recognized by the federal government.
Okay. So the Controlled Substances Act is it providing you cover here
No.
from having to comply with OSHA regulations or EPA?
Exactly.
Okay, well that makes sense, and I would imagine for a lot of operators, it's probably not something that they had on their radar. So can you give us a sense of how do we determine whether state or federal regulations apply? Is there a minimum number of employees required, or what should we be looking at as operators?
You really touched on something interesting there, in that there is a common misconception within the cannabis industry, or within any industry, something that's commonly called the rule of 10. And that's the idea that if you have less than 10 employees, OSHA regulations don't apply to you. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, so I'm familiar with old wives' tales like, if you drink coffee, it's going to stunt your growth, or if you pluck a gray hair, 2 of them are going to grow in its place. The rule of 10 is basically an old wives' tale aligned with that. There is record keeping that's required. There's hazardous communication that's required. That's maybe one of the big blind spots that happens to a cannabis grower or processor, in that you're using materials that are regulated, pesticides, fertilizers. You may be using butane in your processing. Those materials require specific handling, specific types of storage, and there is a right to know among your employees of what they're working with, and what potential hazards are associated with those materials. You can't use illegal materials. You can't use a banned pesticide or a banned fertilizer. But those that are deemed appropriate for use by the EPA or by OSHA require the owner operator to let their folks know what they're dealing with and what precautions they may need to take in order to safely utilize these materials.
And I think that makes sense, and I bet a lot of operators probably are hopefully doing a lot of these things because you'd want to keep your employees safe, or you want your customers to be safe. You want a product that's safe at the end of the day. But I imagine there's probably a lot of specificity in the details surround handling or letting your employees know that needs to be executed properly to be in compliance with the regulations.
Absolutely. A difficult blind spot for someone who is trying to do a good job and take care of their people is understanding what is required by the EPA in order to protect your employees, and having materials available. It's something as simple as getting a material safety data sheet that will come when the operator gets a delivery of a pesticide or a fertilizer, and making sure that that information is accessible to all their employees, and if necessary, that they're providing training and understanding for their employees. Most of the issues turn up when there has been a problem, when someone gets hurt, when someone is working on scaffolding and it falls apart and they're injured. OSHA comes in to evaluate, even though it's a federally illegal product, operating the business is still subject, again, to the regulations. And that's where some of these things are found out. Oh, I need a fall protection program? I didn't really understand that. Oh, someone has been inhaling something associated with these materials that we're using, and day to day or acutely it's not a risk, but over time there could be an issue with this. Well, that might be on the safety data sheet. That information is required by law to be available to the employees who are working with that material.
And that makes good sense. And I love how you phrased it there, because it's kind of, I think we picked an excellent title for this episode, and that you don't know what you don't know, and that's, I think, a really really important message to get across. not just operators, but it's a good rule of thumb for life generally, is that you want to be aware of what you don't know,
Right.
so that you can protect yourself. Because the excuse, well, I didn't know I was supposed to do that, that's not one that really plays out particularly well in court or in an explanation with a regulatory body.
Particularly when it's after the fact. And again, if someone is operating a small business, 10 or 15 or 25 employees, the potential that OSHA is going to knock on your door and evaluate what you're doing, there's some potential, but it is limited. In the event of an injury, an accident, an environmental incident where material is released to a sewer system or a stream, there will be follow-up activity and evaluation from OSHA or from the EPA or from the state-specific environmental agency. And that's when people will look back at, well, what preparation did you take? What methods were you using to keep your employees informed? And it's not that people don't want to have a safe operation or an environmentally sensitive and sustainable operation. You brought that up. People go into business and they want to do a good job. They want to protect their employees. But when it comes to getting a permit and getting a space to set your operation up in and setting up your supply chain, along with encouraging your people to work safely and ask for anything they need, there are a bevy of processes and programs that these regulatory agencies expect that you'll have in place.
What are some of the basic areas of regulation that growers should be mindful of when it comes to EHS regulations?
The first one that we've touched on is hazard communication. What do you have stored on site? What are you using in your process? What are the characteristics of that material? May it be an eye irritant? May it be a danger if it's ingested? And how are people informed of those potential risks and what needs to be done to mitigate those risks? Cultivating operation might work with machinery. So what are your processes to maintain and assure electrical safety when people are working with electrical equipment, when someone is making a repair to equipment, making a repair to the main power box for the facility? It could be fuel powered equipment, high-lows, cultivating equipment. What are your machine safety training programs that you have in place so that, what happens when a machine jams and a person puts his hand into the machine to unjam what's in there? And when there's an accident, yes, everyone steps back and says, wow, that lady really shouldn't have put her hand in there. But a regulator is going to say, what steps did you have in place and what understanding did that person have going into that situation of how that machine may bind up and what one needs to do in order to properly address it.
Yeah, and kind of touching on worker safety, one that always seems to jump out to me, and it was news to me when I first heard it, is I've been in enough cultivation facilities now that I remember to bring my sunglasses with me when I leave my car. And I think most cultivation facilities now are, they provide sunglasses to employees because of how bright the lights are for the plants. But ear protection seems to me to be something that is a huge kind of blind spot for operators because, it becomes white noise in the background, all the fans and all the other machinery running. But over time, the decibel level in the facilities are usually quite high and probably above the threshold for requiring hearing protection. And so it seems to me that's probably another blind spot. I'd love to hear a little bit more, if you could, Jerry, on what EHS can do to help these operators as they try to navigate through EHS compliance.
So One of the things that we have developed for the cannabis industry is an evaluation and gap analysis. Um, in the environmental consulting world, we're asked to audit facilities. Again, anything from a mom and pop stamping plant to an auto manufacturing facility, and determine what laws and what regulations apply to the operation. Um, and then do a simple evaluation of what that company is doing, what that operation is doing, and how well it complies with the applicable regulations. The beauty of some state programs within the cannabis industry is a number of states allow for a
Like a voluntary audit?
a voluntary audit with protection, in that items that you find that might be a violation won't be treated as a violation if you take actions to mitigate that risk or correct the element in the operation that's out of compliance. That's available through state programs, and I imagine Dykema's clients take advantage of the privilege that these can be performed under, which allows a lot of that same protection in being able to correct deficiencies and issues before they're a violation or a finable violation.
Yeah, that's you hit the nail on the head. That's such a great program to be able to take advantage of. I like to call it a regulatory hall pass. you get the opportunity for the regulator to come in and scrutinize you without having the ability to come in and hammer you for a violation. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity that I think more operators really should be taking advantage of. And I imagine EHS would be able to come in and help when it comes time to actually implement changes that may be required out of such a review.
Right. Our name is EHS support, and that's the intent. An element that should not be overlooked is so much of this information regarding the regulations and what you have to do, processes, ways to set up an environmental program, ways to set up a health and safety program. If you go on the EPA website, or if you go on the Eagle website or the OSHA website, there's loads of materials that will spell out step by step what you need to do. Our organization helps people at whatever gap they have within that process. Is it setting up an environmental committee within your organization and setting some goals for how you're going to manage the materials that you're using? That's something we can help with. We can go in and provide people on site to run it for you as needed, but that's generally not needed, particularly in a small business. One thing that we have observed and we do recommend for any small business like a cannabis grower or processor is health and safety, environmental compliance, sustainability. These are things that can be assigned to someone, but they're much more successful when they're ingrained in the planning process. And that's where challenges with environmental health and safety from our perspective are often a knee-jerk kind of reaction, in that, we have to comply with XYZ, let's get someone to do that. And there's the best intentions, and the person tries their best in an area that is maybe very foreign to them. But we've found the most success comes in the business planning process, getting management involved, getting whomever might be in charge of it. Generally, it's an operations person or sometimes a human resources person, but then getting the staff involved as well, and creating some type of input mechanism so that people can understand, all right, these are our unique needs, and making sure that our people can execute their work safely. Now you go into the planning process. It's much more effective at that point, and certainly easier to do.
I couldn't agree with you more. I know my clients will, hear me say all the time is that compliance is everybody's responsibility at the business. And usually my focus is more on the cannabis specific regulations. But if the compliance aspect isn't part of the company's fundamental culture and DNA, and you're instead going to tap one person to run the whole thing, my experience is it just doesn't really work. And it causes some communication breakdowns because the people that you're charging every day with running the business are the ones ultimately responsible for ensuring your compliance. And if you're not ingraining that culture in there, you may be missing opportunities for improvement and innovation in your compliance as well. That can just get lost when you've tapped it for just one person and placed all that burden on them.
Exactly. The regulation says you need to operate safely. The person who is operating each day, just to make it very simple, is the one who has the best understanding of this is the additional equipment I need, this is the clearance of workspace that I need that I don't currently have. They're best able to provide the input. The other thing that it eliminates is friction, in that, yeah, if there's a point person who's reporting up to management, but then trying to help the people at plant level execute, that's not always balanced. And having a broader group work together to understand and then decide what they're going to execute, again, is a much more efficient way.
Yeah. Now let's talk briefly. We'll change a little bit of gears here. We've talked a lot about what folks should do on the front end to have their compliance in place. You and I both know that unfortunately there are cases where regulatory action has been brought for a violation of an EHS rule. Can EHS supports assist in that circumstance as well?
Absolutely. If there's a violation, then what the state is going to be, or the federal agency is going to be interested in, is, okay, how do we remedy this? How do we change the operation so that the person can operate safely? You're using a pesticide that has an exposure risk of X, Y, or Z when used over time. Is there an alternate that you could use that doesn't have some of those chemical characteristics that will be just as effective in your operation? You found something in your batch available for retail sale that has a chemical that isn't allowed for use anymore. May have come from soil that you imported that came from an historic farm that used that pesticide sometime in the past, and it has remained. We have people who can help with chemical analysis and forensic analysis to help pinpoint where the violation came from, help pinpoint corrective actions to get the group in compliance.
That's tremendously helpful. I know from my experience, when there's a violation, the regulator's first question is usually, what are you doing to fix this in the future?
Right.
And I think that's most operators' priority as well, because if I'm getting a violation for something, the last thing I'm going to do is get violated for the same darn thing again.
Because the price only goes up.
Yeah. So that's tremendously helpful, and that's excellent to know. I'd like to also kind of ask, we've talked about compliance on the front end, we've talked about enforcement and disciplinary action. At the initial investment stage, or as operators are looking to add sustainability to their practice, is there any service that EHS support can assist on that front end, on the initial investment or business planning stages?
From a sustainability standpoint, absolutely. We have a group that evaluates alternative energy. And part of that is evaluating whether, say, a solar array is going to be applicable and helpful in defraying costs for the energy sources for your operation. But there's other elements within that. A lot of states and some municipalities have alternative energy credit programs where not only from solar that you are putting on your own property, but if the utility that you buy power from has a certain alternative energy footprint that they're utilizing, you can get federal credits or state credits for from drawing your electricity from that power source. Water use, water management, water reuse. We cut our teeth in this industry helping big oil companies and big chemical companies with massive groundwater issues and being able to treat that water and return it to productive use. Those same scientific concepts apply when you're using water in your operation, and water is a big could be potentially a big cost based on where the growing operation is located, and then being able to treat that water as needed if it needs to be disposed or in closed loop systems, enhance the effectiveness of that water, add nutrients to it, and then add that to your growing operation. We have a lot of experience in closed loop systems like that.
Yeah, that's all excellent information. I know there's probably some significant opportunity for cost savings on the front end by bringing in a firm like yours to help evaluate some of these, especially on the manufacturing side, a lot of these kind of utility and input costs that go into things. And obviously, I think any operator in this space has probably seen a municipal requirement for a wastewater treatment plan. So
Right.
That becomes a huge part of this process. Let's kind of conclude here with taking a look into the future from an EHS regulation standpoint. Do you expect any changes if we do get federal legalization of marijuana here, or is the playing field really set already?
No, I think one of the things that the current administration has talked about and has shown some activity in the past year is stepping up OSHA evaluation and enforcement, more field agents, quicker responsiveness to accidents, and then more proactive evaluations. I said earlier on, it's not likely that OSHA is going to come knocking on your door. There is an interest within the agencies today to make that a more normal occurrence. I think the same can be said for EPA and the strength of that agency within the current framework, not only of the administration, but also what people are interested in. People are very interested in sustainable practices and safe practices. It's part of the buying decision for more and more people. And so being more attentive to these things based on the regulation or based on the ESG brand that you want to present for your product, I think is only going to become greater in the coming years.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm cautious and wary of changes at the federal level, particularly as it comes to energy consumption, and climate change as it relates to these facilities, especially you have an indoor grow generating a lot of electricity. I think it's not unreasonable to think you might see some changes there from a regulatory perspective as to how those businesses are required to operate or maybe offset some of their traditional electrical use. So, Jerry, what else should operators be thinking about as they navigate EHS regulations in this space?
One of the things that is sometimes overlooked is communicating with your local fire marshal. If you're using ethanol or butane in your process, if you're storing fuel for backup generators, through Sarah reporting, there's a community right to know requirement where it's not punitive, it's not challenging. The fire department just wants to know what you have on your site, so if there's an emergency, they know how to prepare. There's also, based on what pesticides, what fertilizers you may be using, some states have a chemical inventory reporting and quantities used, storage that you have, just understanding where these materials are going. Different quantities used might trigger different type of requirements for reporting or for the way that you store them. And so it's important to set up an inventory system. Of course, in your business, you're going to have an inventory system so you understand what you're using and you understand that cost. The municipality that you're in or the state that you're in may want to have access and an understanding of that information as well.
That's great to know, and especially those reporting obligations seem like they're fairly easy to comply with. Probably it's just the action of having that process in place to make sure you are affirmatively reporting what's
Exactly.
required.
If you're managing your business, you're going to have that information and understand that information anyway. Sometimes people don't understand that there's a layer of reporting that goes along with it.
That makes perfect sense. Well, that's it for us today. I want to thank Jerry Hincka from EHS Support for being my guest. Jerry, thank you so much for the conversation and for the extremely valuable information here today. We look forward to having yourself or another member of your team on an episode here again with us in the near future, kind of diving into more of the nitty gritty details on specific tips and tricks for operators. So thank you so much again for joining me here today.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, John. Thanks to Dykema for setting this up.
Our pleasure entirely. So thanks all again. As always, you can find us at youtube.com/Dykema Law. My name is John Frazier, and I look forward to seeing you next time on A Higher Law.